The man on the crate, whom the auctioneer had cruelly named Savage, was not a beast, though he was bound and bloody like one. His chest was a roadmap of scar tissue, crisscrossed with fresh, weeping lash marks from a week on the trail, and his wrists were chafed raw where the rope bit into his skin. His head was bowed, the long, dark hair matted with grime, concealing eyes that, even in defeat, held a spark of unyielding, furious dignity. He was tall, powerfully built, and clearly suffering from starvation and dehydration, yet the sheer physical presence he commanded forced a cruel silence from the rough men surrounding the block, a silence the whip-wielding auctioneer, a grizzled tyrant named Malachi, desperately tried to break with his bluster. Malachi prattled on about the man's supposed ferocity, his untamable nature, and his alleged violence, spinning a grotesque tale to drive up the price on the human chattel he was selling. He yelled, spitting flecks of tobacco juice, "Look at him! Untamed! A brute! He'll break your back and curse your name, but he'll move a mountain for you if you can keep the leash tight. Who'll start the bidding on this magnificent savage? $500. Who says 500 for this animal?" The cruelty of the word animal hung in the air, a sickening, familiar stench in this corner of the Wild West where human worth was judged by labor and obedience. Savage didn't flinch, didn't utter a sound, but a single, slow tear tracked a path through the dust on his cheek, a silent testament to a spirit that was being crushed, but not yet broken. He focused all his remaining strength on the tear, letting it drop, a single, deliberate act of defiance against the man who had stolen his freedom. The crowd roared with dark laughter and low, vulgar bids, the voices of greed and malice washing over Savage like a foul tide. The bids crept up slowly, 600, 700, fueled by the promises of backbreaking labor and the perverse pleasure of owning another human being, a grotesque transaction of power and degradation. Malachi, sensing the excitement of the bloodthirsty bidders, drew back his whip, a terrible theatrical gesture, threatening to demonstrate Savage's unruly nature with a sharp, sickening crack. The man tensed, bracing for the inevitable, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched visibly beneath the dust. It was at this moment, the moment of ultimate humiliation and impending pain, that the silence was shattered not by the whip, but by a voice that cut through the noise like a silver knife. It was a woman's voice, clear, strong, and utterly defiant, carrying an authority that was unexpected in this brutal, male-dominated arena. She stood at the edge of the crowd, a figure of striking contrast in the grime of Redemption Pass, dressed in tailored, dark blue wool, a fine, wide-brimmed hat casting her face in a purposeful shadow, and carrying herself with the unmistakable posture of wealth and unwavering intention. The men turned to stare, their cruel smiles fading to confused scowls, unsure how to react to this sudden, elegant interruption of their sordid entertainment. Her name was Alara Vance, and she had ridden 3 days from her family's prosperous mining stake in the Black Hills, driven by a whispered rumor of a man being sold in Redemption Pass, a man rumored to be of a lineage she desperately sought to find. She strode through the parted crowd, her gaze fixed not on Malachi, but on the silent, suffering man on the block, assessing him not for his muscle, but for the depth of pain in his posture, the weary yet unbroken dignity in his slack features. Her voice was steady, a deep contralto that commanded attention without shouting, a clear declaration that she was not to be trifled with. "Don't hurt him," she declared, the words ringing with absolute authority, causing Malachi's whip hand to freeze mid-air. "I'll buy him," she said, her voice dropping to a low, firm register, her eyes holding the auctioneer's with an unnerving intensity. A gasp went through the crowd, quickly followed by a rush of snickers and crude commentary on a woman interfering with men's business. Malachi, flustered and irritated by the disruption, sneered down at her, the sweat glistening on his unshaven chin. "You, little lady. This ain't no house pet. This is 1,000 pounds of trouble, a pure savage who'd slit your throat for a crust of bread. What good is this brute to a woman like you?" The auctioneer's attempt to shame her, to put her back in her place, only served to harden Alara's resolve, transforming her gaze from simple determination to cold, righteous fury. Her name was Alara Vance, and she had ridden 3 days from her family's prosperous mining stake in the Black Hills, driven by a whispered rumor of a man being sold in Redemption Pass, a man rumored to be of a lineage she desperately sought to find. She strode through the parted crowd, her gaze fixed not on Malachi, but on the silent, suffering man on the block, assessing him not for his muscle, but for the depth of pain in his posture, the weary yet unbroken dignity in his slack features. Her voice was steady, a deep contralto that commanded attention without shouting, a clear declaration that she was not to be trifled with. "Don't hurt him," she declared, the words ringing with absolute authority, causing Malachi's whip hand to freeze mid-air. "I'll buy him," she said, her voice dropping to a low, firm register, her eyes holding the auctioneers with an unnerving intensity. A gasp went through the crowd, quickly followed by a rush of snickers and crude commentary on a woman interfering with men's business. Malachi, flustered and irritated by the disruption, sneered down at her, the sweat glistening on his unshaven chin. "You, little lady. This ain't no house pet. This is 1,000 pounds of trouble, a pure savage who'd slit your throat for a crust of bread. What good is this brute to a woman like you?" The auctioneer's attempt to shame her, to put her back in her place, only served to harden Alara's resolve, transforming her gaze from simple determination to cold, righteous fury. The sheer weight of the gold and the terrifying power of her threat hit Malachi with the force of a mule kick to the chest. $2,500 was a king's ransom in Redemption Pass, enough to set him up for life far away from the dangers of the territory. He glanced desperately at the stunned crowd, then down at the heavy bag of gold dust, the decision tearing at his greedy soul. His eyes darted back to Alara's, which remained utterly cold and implacable, signaling that she was not bluffing and would carry out her threat without remorse. He knew a force of nature when he saw one, and this woman, with her expensive clothes and diamond-sharp gaze, was more dangerous than a stampede. Malachi, defeated, spat one final curse into the dirt. "Done," he growled, the word heavy with reluctant submission, dropping the whip to the ground as a sign of his surrender. The tension in the street snapped like an overtaut rope. Alara nodded once, a gesture of quiet triumph, and then, slowly, deliberately, she walked toward the block. She reached up and, with a quiet tenderness that felt profoundly out of place, began to unknot the ropes securing Savage's wrists. As the ropes fell away, Savage slowly lifted his head, his eyes, dark and haunted, meeting hers for the very first time. They shared a gaze that lasted only a moment, but in it, 1,000 questions were asked and answered. He saw a selfless, impossible bravery, she saw a deep, profound suffering. A quiet promise passed between them, a silent pact sealed in the dust and the gold, a promise of a future she would fight for. He was hers now, a heavy burden and an uncertain hope, and the only thing Savage saw in her eyes was the terrifying and impossible truth: she had just risked everything to save him. She had bought a man who was, by all accounts, a monster, and he had no idea why. The sheer, dizzying relief of freedom, coupled with the crushing reality of his ownership, slammed into Savage, or Kalen, as was his true, forgotten name, with the force of a physical blow. When Alara's fingers, surprisingly soft yet firm, first touched his arm, he flinched, not from malice, but from the simple, terrifying shock of human kindness after months of brutalizing neglect. The rope burns on his wrists felt like fire, but the absence of the binding weight was a liberation he hadn't dared to dream of, a sudden, vast emptiness where constant pain used to reside. He looked at the woman, this impossible savior, with a raw, calculating intensity. Kalen was wary, deeply conditioned to distrust every soul that walked the dust of the territories, knowing that pity was often just a prelude to a different, more refined form of cruelty. Why would she pay such a monumental price for him? He searched her eyes, finding no lust or simple pity, but a steady, profound determination that chilled him more than any slave driver's whip. He could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes and the fine lines of worry that didn't quite disappear when she smiled, or, rather, didn't smile. She wasn't an angel, she was a woman on a desperate mission, and he was the tool she had purchased. She looked at him, her lips forming silent words, "Are you able to walk?" and Kalen, without speaking, simply nodded once, a gesture so stiff it felt like a betrayal of his own pride. He knew the debt was massive, the expectation higher, and the danger of this fragile, temporary freedom was still looming, threatening to snap shut on him at any moment. Malachi, the auctioneer, quickly scooped up the bag of gold dust, weighing its glorious heft in his hands, his eyes still burning with grudging resentment at the woman who had bested him. The rest of the crowd remained, a restless, muttering knot of men whose sense of justice had been offended by the exorbitant price and, more significantly, by a woman exercising such brazen power. Crude remarks about Ilara's future intentions with her new brute began to circulate, low whistles and vulgar suggestions filling the vacuum of the auctioneer's departure. Ilara, sensing the rapid deterioration of the situation and the sudden spike in danger, did not hesitate. She moved with a quick, practiced efficiency that surprised Kalen, a man who thought he knew every sign of weakness. She reached inside her coat and, in a flash of polished steel, pulled out a Colt revolver, the barrel gleaming wickedly in the harsh afternoon light. She didn't point it at anyone specifically, but raised it slightly, holding it steady and ready, a silent, unequivocal warning. Her back was now turned to Kalen, a staggering act of trust in the man the entire town had just labeled a savage. She addressed the men in a voice that was low, calm, and utterly devoid of fear, cutting through their jeers like a razor. This man is now under the protection of the Vance Mining Company. We have paid a fair price. The transaction is final. Any man who follows us, who lays a hand on either of us, or who so much as utters another vulgar word, will have to deal directly with my family's considerable influence, and my far less considerable patience. The men, instantly recognizing the deadly combination of wealth, legal authority, and raw, immediate threat, began to shuffle their feet, their hostility giving way to cold, grudging respect for a woman who clearly knew how to hold her ground. Kalen watched the exchange from behind her, his senses heightened, his heart hammering against his ribs in a strange mix of fear and admiration. He saw not the rich lady, but the ruthless pragmatist, a woman who understood the language of power in the territories better than most men. The way she held the heavy Colt, balanced, ready, and clearly familiar, spoke volumes. Her threat was not empty bluster, it was a clear statement of capability. He mentally catalogued the details, the small tremor in her hand that suggested inner tension, quickly masked by the steel of her resolve, the slight widening of her stance for better balance, the way she scanned the crowd not with fear, but with tactical assessment. This woman was not naive, she was dangerous. For the first time since his capture, Kalen felt a flicker of something besides resentment and pain, a spark of grudging respect for the sheer audacity of her action. His survival instincts, honed to a razor's edge, told him that whatever her motives, aligning with her, for now, was the only path to safety. He slowly reached down and picked up the canvas satchel she had tossed at his feet. Inside, he felt the reassuring weight of clean water and, most crucially, a hidden knife, a silent, unspoken gift of agency and defense. Ilara stood there, holding the hostile gaze of the remaining men until she was certain they were truly intimidated. The moment the tension eased, she holstered the Colt with a decisive snap and turned back to Kalen, her expression softening only marginally. She offered him a quick, measured glance that seemed to ask, "Are you ready?" And when he met her gaze with a silent nod, she began to walk, leading him away from the auction block, away from the stench of human commerce, and toward the stable where she had left her horse. She maintained a quick, steady pace, never looking back, implicitly trusting him to follow. Kalen followed at a respectful distance, the canvas bag containing the water and knife slung over his shoulder, the first burden he had carried in months that wasn't solely pain. As they walked, the setting sun, now a fiery red orb, cast long, distorted shadows across the dusty street, making the two of them look like solitary figures against the colossal backdrop of the indifferent, unforgiving West. The silence between them was not awkward, but heavy with unspoken narratives and deep-seated caution. Kalen knew he had been saved, but he did not yet know what he had been saved for. Was he a servant? A guard? A prize? He felt a new kind of chain forming around him, a chain forged not of iron, but of debt, gratitude, and a mystery he desperately needed to solve. They reached the edge of the settlement where Ilara's strong, well-fed mare, Rhea, was tethered patiently to a hitching post. Ilara mounted the horse with practiced grace, pulling herself up easily despite the stiffness of her traveling clothes. She looked down at Kalen, who remained standing on the ground, his posture still rigidly defensive, like an animal expecting a sudden blow. She did not offer him a ride, a deliberate choice that communicated his role was not that of a partner, but a follower, a newly acquired asset. She pointed a gloved hand toward a thin, barely visible trail leading out into the scrubland, away from the main road. We ride west. We do not stop until the moon is high. You will keep pace. We do not speak until we reach the camp. Is that clear? Her voice was low and firm, not unkind, but professional, establishing the boundaries of their new, transactional relationship. Kalen, understanding that his only currency was obedience and endurance, simply met her gaze, his dark eyes conveying a reluctant acceptance. He nodded once, the silent affirmation serving as his oath, a silent oath to follow, to endure, and to uncover the reason why she had gone to such desperate lengths to claim him. As Ilara urged Rhea into a fast trot, Kalen turned and started running, his powerful, starved legs eating up the dry ground, a shadow tethered to a single, urgent hope. The only thing he carried was the satchel and the haunting knowledge that, though his body was free, his life now belonged entirely to the woman who had named his price. He ran west, into the night, toward a debt he knew he would eventually have to repay in full, a debt whose nature remained a profound and terrifying secret. The grueling night ride stretched Kalen's already depleted physical reserves to their limit, yet an internal, primal engine of survival drove him forward, his bare feet kicking up miniature clouds of dust with every stride. Ilara maintained a punishing, relentless pace, ensuring no pursuers from Redemption Pass would have the tenacity to follow, but also testing the very limits of the man she had just purchased. Kalen ran silently, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and calculation. He noted the precise rhythm of Rhea's hoofbeats, the subtle shifts in Ilara's posture indicating fatigue, and the way her head frequently turned to scan the dark horizon, suggesting she feared something far more dangerous than disgruntled townspeople. The water from the satchel had revived him, dulling the agonizing hunger, but the deeper wounds, the mental scars of the past months, remained raw and throbbing. Every muscle screamed for rest, yet the memory of the auction block, the taste of humiliation, and the sight of Malachi's greedy smile fueled his desperate momentum. He ran not just to keep pace with her horse, but to outrun the ghost of the man he was forced to be, that a savage, who had almost succumbed to despair. He knew that the moment he faltered, the moment he showed weakness, his fragile freedom might be revoked by his new owner, whose compassion he still mistrusted as a calculated facade. Just as the faint, bruised light of pre-dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Ilara finally slowed Rhea, pulling up near a cluster of jagged, ancient rock formations that offered natural shelter and excellent defensive cover. She slid off the mare with a weariness she could no longer hide, her shoulders slumping momentarily before she forced herself straight again. The moment she dismounted, Kalen stopped his relentless run, breathing heavily but steadily, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for the command that would define his immediate future. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by Rhea's soft snorts and the ragged rhythm of Kalen's breathing. Ilara walked over to a dry patch of ground and dropped her saddlebags, immediately setting about the efficient routine of a seasoned traveler, checking the water, rubbing down Rhea's legs, and scoping the surroundings with a keen, practiced eye. She ignored Kalen for nearly 5 minutes, a deliberate act that communicated her focus on the task at hand and his subordinate status. Finally, she looked at him, her face smudged with dust and exhaustion, and in the pale light, her expression seemed vulnerable, almost gentle. "There are dried meats and biscuits in that bag," she said, her voice hoarse from the dry air, nodding toward the satchel. "Eat. Drink. Rest. We ride again by midday." Kalen obeyed instantly, his movements stiff with fatigue but precise. He reached into the satchel and pulled out a generous portion of dried venison and a dense, wholesome biscuit. The sight and smell of real food, not the scraps and slop he'd been thrown, was almost overwhelming. He instinctively took a small, guarded step back from Elara, a lifetime of conditioning dictating that food was a solitary, hard-won prize. However, before he could take a bite, a deep, unsettling suspicion flared in his mind. He paused, holding the food, and his eyes searched Elara's face. Was this food poisoned? Was this a trick? His entire life had taught him that generosity was always a trap, a lever of control. He stood motionless for a long moment, the venison in his hand, his primal hunger warring with his absolute distrust. Elara, sitting on her saddle blanket, watched his hesitation, understanding the silent battle raging within him. She didn't press him, she simply reached into her own saddlebag, pulled out an identical biscuit, and slowly, deliberately, took a bite, chewing calmly and staring into the distance. It was the simple, silent act of sharing the potential risk that broke Kalen's paralyzing caution, an unspoken promise of good faith. He lowered his guard just enough, and finally, he devoured the food, his hunger overriding his suspicion, the first true nourishment he'd tasted in months. When Kalen had finished the food, his breathing steadied, and the color returned marginally to his gaunt cheeks, Elara finally allowed herself to speak about the real matter at hand, choosing her words with careful precision, knowing the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. She looked directly at him, her gaze penetrating and unwavering, not as a master looking at a slave, but as someone searching for a lost piece of a puzzle. "They called you savage," she began, the word a soft curse on her tongue, "but that is not your name. Your name, if my information is correct, is Kalen." The effect of hearing his true name, a name he thought had been erased from existence, was like a physical shock. Kalen flinched, his eyes widening in raw, unadulterated surprise, a deep flicker of the man he once was returning to the surface. He dropped the empty satchel, the sudden reveal stripping away his carefully constructed wall of stoicism. Elara nodded, confirming her knowledge. "Kalen, son of Torvin, the blacksmith of Oakhaven. I did not buy a brute, I bought a ghost. And now, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to your family and how you came to be sold on that miserable block." Emotional flashback shot, a dark forge, the flash of fire, and the shadow of a betrayal. The question hung heavy in the silence of the dawn, a devastating weight of painful memory. Kalen stared at the dry earth, his posture crumbling from defensive readiness into profound sorrow. The mention of his father, Torvin, and the old home, Oakhaven, felt like a distant, agonizing dream. The secrets of his past, the betrayal, the violence, and the ultimate shattering of his life, were not details he willingly shared, especially not with a stranger, a buyer. Yet, Elara's knowledge of his real name had already breached the thickest walls of his distrust. He slowly lifted his head, meeting her gaze with eyes that were now swimming with unshed tears and a terrible, cold rage. He was silent for a long moment, organizing the chaotic pieces of memory, the night the raiders came, the smell of burning wood, the glint of a familiar knife, the face of the man who sold him out, all fragments of a life brutally stolen. He knew he owed her his life, a debt that demanded transparency, but the memory was a physical agony. Finally, Kalen found his voice, a raw, unused sound that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of years of suffering. He began to speak, his narrative not a tale of savage, but the tragic, humiliating history of a man wronged, setting the stage for the truth. He wasn't a brute, he was a victim, and his story was about to be told. He told her, simply and without embellishment, that his family's land and life had been stolen by a powerful syndicate, and he was sold into slavery by the one man he had trusted most. The confession hung in the air, the first fragile thread of their shared destiny now woven between them. Kalen finished his sparse, devastating account of the betrayal, how his childhood friend, Corvus, had orchestrated the raid on Oakhaven, seizing the family land and lucrative iron works, then selling Kalen to the first slaver who passed through. The raw honesty in his voice, devoid of self-pity but heavy with the shame of being so easily manipulated, confirmed to Elara that her intuition was right. Kalen was a man of strength, betrayed, not a beast of malice. Elara listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on the map she was now sketching in the dirt, a crude but detailed representation of the Western Territories, marking key mountain passes, mining towns, and, crucially, a central, heavily fortified location labeled, Fortress Corvus. She used the stick not as a pointer, but as an extension of her will, carving the fate of her enemies into the dry earth. When Kaelin finally fell silent, Elara looked up, her expression a mixture of profound sympathy for his loss and a focused, intense determination. She spoke not of comfort, but of strategy, confirming his suspicions that her intervention was driven by a larger, shared purpose. Corvus. That name is familiar, she stated, her voice sharp with recognition. He's been carving out a nasty little empire in the foothills, controlling the trade routes. The irony is, Kaelin, the man who destroyed your life is the same man who is destroying my family's future. Elara paused, letting the significance of the shared enemy settle between them, establishing the foundation of their alliance, a union forged in mutual vengeance and desperate necessity. She tapped a specific spot on the crude map, a point near the high canyon ridges, marked with a stylized V. My family, the Van Cess, own the largest, most profitable silver and copper claim in this entire region, she revealed, her tone shifting from personal grief to corporate urgency. But Corvus, that opportunistic vulture, has systematically used his ruthlessness to intimidate, bribe, and scare off the freight companies that service our mine. He's cutting off our supply lines, running up our costs, and trying to choke us out of business so he can swoop in and claim the mineral rights. She looked Kaelin dead in the eye, her gaze an open, honest admission of her motives. I didn't buy a laborer, Kaelin. I bought a man with deep, personal knowledge of Corvus's methods, his weaknesses, and his history. I paid $2,500 not for your strength, but for your mind, your loyalty, and your burning need for revenge. This blunt, transactional honesty was far more reassuring to Kaelin than any false show of charity. It gave him a clear role and a tangible purpose. He was not a slave, but a partner in a high-stakes war, an arrangement that restored the dignity stolen from him. The truth resonated deeply within Kaelin, restoring a sense of agency he hadn't felt since his betrayal. The shame of being a victim began to recede, replaced by the hot, clarifying focus of a man with a target. He finally understood the gravity of his purpose. His intimate knowledge of Corvus, the bully's childhood fears, his fatal arrogance, and the hidden flaws in his hastily built operations, was indeed worth far more than the price Elara had paid. Kaelin had known Corvus since they were boys, and knew precisely where the man kept his secrets buried. He reached into the satchel and slowly, deliberately, pulled out the heavy, balanced knife Elara had provided. He tested its edge with his thumb, the cool steel a comfort, a quiet promise of retribution. He looked up at Elara, his eyes now alight with a cold, focused fire that banished the shadow of savage. Corvus will be expecting anyone pursuing him to come with guns blazing and loud threats, Kaelin stated, his voice now regaining some of its natural depth, the sound of a strong man thinking clearly. He never expects cunning. He never expects subtlety. And most of all, he added, a grim smile touching his lips, he never expected the man he sold for a few silver pieces to walk back into his life. Elara, recognizing the shift in Kaelin's demeanor, the resurrection of the man within the ruin, knew the time for soft words was over. This was a reconnaissance mission, a stealthy probe into Corvus's domain, and it required a clean, intelligent operative, not a half-starved shadow. She stood and walked back to her saddlebags, extracting a sturdy, but well-worn set of plainsman's clothes, dark trousers, a strong canvas shirt, and a heavy, serviceable leather jacket, all practical, anonymous, and far from the finery she wore, yet a deliberate symbol of their partnership. She tossed them to Kaelin, a silent instruction to clean himself up and discard the rags of his past. Then, in an action that further cemented his non-servant status, she handed him a small, heavy pouch of silver coins. This is for expenses, information, and safe lodging. You are not a scout, Kaelin, she stated firmly, meeting his gaze. You are an operative. We need to know his defenses, his daily movements, and, most importantly, the weak point in his supply chain. If we can sever his grip on the trade routes, his entire, fragile empire will collapse. You go in clean, you blend in, and you learn everything. Kalen took the clothes and the silver, a profound sense of gratitude washing over him, not for the objects, but for the respect they represented. He found a small, hidden pool of rainwater trapped in the rocks, stripped down to the waist, and began to wash away the layers of dust, blood, and humiliation that had defined his existence for the last few months. As he scrubbed the dirt from his skin and combed the grime from his hair, the transformation was stark and immediate. The savage Malachi had soul dissolved, revealing the strong, clear-eyed man beneath, the intelligent blacksmith's son, hardened by suffering but not broken. He put on the fresh, clean clothes, feeling the cool, unfamiliar weight of the silver in his pocket. It was the first time in memory that he had felt truly clean, truly armed, and truly autonomous. He looked at Alara, who was watching him with a quiet satisfaction, and he finally spoke, his voice strong and clear, the last vestiges of the slave dissolving with the setting sun. Tell me where he is hoarding his goods and who his main contact is. I will find the weak link in his chain, Alara. You bought a man worth saving. Now, I will prove that I am a man worth trusting. Corvus will not see me coming. I know exactly where he keeps his most valuable secrets, and it's not his fortress. It didn't take long for Kalen's keen eye, trained by years in his father's detailed ironworks business, to pick up the first crucial lead. Tucked away behind a busy provisioner's stall, stacked precariously high, was a cache of heavy wooden crates awaiting transport. They were unmarked to the casual observer, but Kalen noticed a faint, peculiar scorch mark on the corner of the topmost crate, a distinct, almost invisible brand that Kalen instantly recognized. It was the mark of the old Oakhaven Ironworks, a subtle, proprietary symbol his father had used on specific, heavy-duty goods, mainly transport crates and high-grade tools intended for mining operations. The sight of the mark sent a cold, sharp spike of rage and confirmation through his chest. Corvus wasn't just stealing the land, he was stealing the product, moving vast quantities of high-value ore and tools through this very depot, brazenly using the stolen brand to give the goods a false legitimacy. Kalen's assumption was confirmed, the crossroads was the hub. Now he needed the handler. He watched the crates for hours, waiting patiently for the man responsible for their loading and dispatch, knowing that whoever controlled the flow of this stolen freight would be the key to collapsing Corvus's operation. As the afternoon heat intensified, a new figure appeared to supervise the loading of the Oakhaven crates, a man Kalen recognized instantly with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was Silas, a foreman who had worked for Torvin, Kalen's father, for years, a man Kalen had personally taught how to temper steel. Silas was a greasy, jovial man with a loud laugh and eyes that never quite met your own, always the first to offer a compliment and the first to shirk a hard day's work. His presence here confirmed the extent of Corvus's betrayal. It wasn't just an outside raid, it was an internal coup facilitated by trusted hands. Silas, now puffed up with his newfound authority, strutted around the crates, barking orders at the hired hands with a ridiculous self-importance. Kalen watched him, noting every gesture, every nervous glance, and every interaction. He realized that Silas, a man inherently greedy and weak-willed, was likely the vulnerable link in Corvus's chain. He would be easy to manipulate, hard to trust, and definitely susceptible to a significant bribe or, more effectively, a serious threat. Kalen waited until Silas dismissed the laborers for their supper break, leaving him momentarily alone by the heavy crates. The sun dipped low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the crossroads, providing the perfect cover for Kalen to make his move. He approached Silas from the blind side, moving with the quiet, predatory grace honed by his time on the run. Silas was hunched over a manifest, nervously tallying the contents of the shipment, muttering figures to himself. Kalen stopped 5 feet away and spoke one word, his voice low and dangerous, dropping the facade of the tired mule driver. Silas. The foreman instantly froze, his breath hitching in his throat. Slowly, reluctantly, Silas turned around, and the moment his eyes locked onto Kalen's face, the color drained from his skin, replaced by a ghastly, ashen pallor. His jaw slackened, the pipe he was about to light clattering onto the dirt. He was looking at a ghost, the man he had helped condemn to slavery, the man Corvus had sworn was handled. Silas stammered, unable to form a coherent word, his fear a palpable, sickening aroma in the twilight air. Kalen didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You look like you've seen the devil, Silas," Kalen said, his eyes drilling into the foreman's soul. "Tell me where Corvus is moving the silver next. Tell me who he is paying off at the regulator's station. Tell me everything, or I swear by my father's grave, you will wish Malachi had kept you on the auction block instead of me." Silas, a man of pure self-interest and minimal courage, crumbled instantly under the sheer, terrifying resurrection of the man he had wronged. The ghost of Kalen, clean and armed, was far more formidable than the broken savage he remembered. Panic clawed at the foreman's throat, and he began to babble, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperate self-preservation, betraying Corvus without a moment's hesitation. He revealed the destination, a remote, heavily guarded canyon pass known as the Serpent's Tooth, a bottleneck Corvus used to smuggle the high-value ore past the regulator's official checkpoints. He confessed that Corvus paid off a corrupt regulator captain, a man named Captain Thorne, to turn a blind eye to the operation in exchange for a hefty cut of the silver profits. The next shipment, Silas choked out, the massive haul of high-grade copper and silver, was set to move in 3 days, right through the Serpent's Tooth. He was so consumed by terror that he thrust the manifest into Kalen's hand, a desperate offering of appeasement. Kalen took the paper, his eyes glittering with cold satisfaction. The manifest was the evidence, the route was the strategy, and Thorne was the vulnerable, well-placed pawn they needed to exploit. He looked at the trembling Silas, his mission accomplished. "You won't see me again," Kalen promised, his voice low and chilling. "But if I ever hear your name associated with Corvus again, I will come back for you." He melted back into the shadows, leaving Silas sobbing hysterically beside the stolen crates, a broken man who had just traded a life of servitude to a petty tyrant for the terrifying loyalty to a man bent on justice. Kalen had the key, and the next move was to meet Alara and devise a plan to ambush the silver at the Serpent's Tooth and expose the corrupt Captain Thorne. Kalen returned to Alara's secluded camp, not with whispers, but with tangible proof, the stolen manifest and the complete breakdown of Corvus's smuggling operation, courtesy of the terrified Silas. Alara listened to the detailed account, the confirmation of the stolen Oakhaven goods, the route through the Serpent's Tooth, and the identity of the corrupt official, Captain Thorne, with a quiet intensity that betrayed no surprise, only a deep, professional satisfaction. Her decision to trust Kalen had been validated by his swift, intelligent action. Spread out between them on a rough-hewn table inside the cave was a detailed, expensive topographic map of the region. Alara traced the treacherous, twisting canyon of the Serpent's Tooth, a natural choke point where the mountains squeezed the trail down to a single, dangerous lane. "This is perfect," she murmured, her eyes alight with tactical excitement. "A narrow pass means they can't run, and they can't spread out their defense. Corvus is arrogant, he trusts Thorne and the geography to protect him. We will use both against him." Alara began to construct a meticulous plan of engagement, using small, irregularly shaped stones to represent the 3 heavily laden silver wagons and twigs for their limited defensive positions. Their goal was not a massacre, but a clean, indisputable seizure of the stolen goods and, more importantly, the capture of a few key witnesses and the regulator, Thorne. "I will approach the pass from the south, openly," Alara explained, positioning her twig. "I'll use the Vance Mining Company crest on my carriage, a recognized target. It will draw the main attention and security. They'll assume I'm alone, a lone rich woman demanding her goods back." She looked at Kalen, her eyes hardening with the reality of the danger. "You and 2 trusted men from the Vance crew will approach from the high ridges, unseen. The moment I engage Thorne, and his guards are distracted by my inevitable, loud demands, you move. You secure the wagons and isolate Thorne, ensuring he doesn't destroy any evidence." Kalen, analyzing the setup with the mind of a craftsman, immediately spotted a flaw based on his intimate knowledge of Corvus's paranoia. "Corvus always has a secondary security detail, Alara," he interjected, moving one of her stones slightly. They won't be with the wagons. They'll be watching the perimeter from the cliffs overlooking the pass, a small, quiet ambush team. If we hit the wagons first, they'll flank us from above. We need to neutralize the cliff first. The crucial tactical correction Kalen offered was instantly recognized and appreciated by Elara. It was the precise, invaluable knowledge she had paid for, the deep-seated paranoia of a childhood friend turned enemy. She adjusted the plan, adding a new, more dangerous phase. You are right. That secondary team will be the first wave of attack, she conceded, her voice low. You will not only bypass the wagons, Kalen, you will lead a small, stealth team to clear those high ridges before I even arrive. It is the most dangerous part of the job, and it must be done silently, quickly, and without alarming the main convoy. This was the true test of Kalen's worth, placing the mission's most vital and dangerous task entirely in the hands of the man she had bought for a price. It was a massive statement of trust. The moment was not lost on Kalen. This wasn't just a business deal anymore, this was a shared fight for justice and survival. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. I will go in alone, he stated, his voice quiet but absolute. A team makes noise. I know how to move like the shadow I was forced to become. I will clear the ridge and send the signal when the pass is secure. Elara didn't argue or try to talk him out of the solo approach. His logic was sound, and his quiet confidence was the most reassuring thing she had heard since leaving the safety of her home. Instead, she walked over to her personal trunk and retrieved a small, unassuming object, a heavy silver pocket watch, its casing beautifully engraved with the Vance family crest, an heirloom of considerable value and deep sentimental worth. She held it out to Kalen, a silent, profound gesture that superseded their transactional arrangement. I need you to be able to synchronize our timing perfectly, she said, her voice softer than it had been before, conveying an unspoken weight of meaning. My carriage will arrive exactly at noon. You must give the signal 3 minutes before, at $11:57 a.m. Don't be late. Kalen took the watch, the cool weight of the silver a powerful contrast to the grime of his recent past. He didn't need a timepiece, his internal clock was flawless, but he understood the symbolic value. This was her family's trust, placed in the hands of the savage. With the plan finalized and the deadly timing set, Elara prepared to leave, needing a day to stage her carriage and trusted men for the main assault. She stood at the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the bright sun, a figure of formidable resolution. She paused, looking back at Kalen, who was meticulously checking the action of the Colt pistol she had also provided him. Be safe, Kalen, she said, the words simple and heartfelt, the first purely emotional plea she had offered. Kalen stopped his work, looking up from the gun, his eyes meeting hers across the gloom of the cave. He gave her a small, tight nod, a promise forged not in gold, but in the desire for a justice they both desperately needed. I will see you at noon, Elara, he replied, the simplicity of his response containing an absolute pledge of return. As Elara turned and rode away, Kalen clipped the heavy silver watch onto his belt, a constant, ticking reminder of the man he was fighting to become and the woman who had dared to see a man worth saving. The air in the Serpent's Tooth Canyon was still and heavy, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes violence. Kalen began his silent ascent of the northern ridge hours before the appointed time, moving with the practiced, efficient grace of a predator. The steep, treacherous rock face was a challenge that demanded absolute focus, allowing Kalen to lock away the emotional pain and focus purely on the immediate, tangible task of survival and mission execution. The cold, heavy silver watch Elara had given him was clipped securely to his belt, its steady, rhythmic ticking a counterpoint to the fierce, pounding rhythm of his own heart. The cliff face offered almost no handholds, forcing Kalen to rely on minute crevices, sheer friction, and the explosive power in his arms and legs, a strength he had conserved and secretly rebuilt during his time in servitude. He was completely alone, a single shadow against the massive, unforgiving rock, the responsibility of the entire operation resting on the success of this dangerous, solo infiltration. He was hunting Corvus's security team, the 3 men positioned high above the pass, who would be silently watching for any threat from the surrounding mountains. After a brutal, hour-long ascent that left his muscles quivering with exhaustion, Kalen reached the lip of the ridge. He flattened himself against the cold stone, taking 5 deep, controlled breaths to steady his heart rate and clear his vision. Just as he had predicted, Corvus's perimeter team was positioned there, 3 heavily armed men, relaxed and careless, huddled around a tiny, smoking fire, their attention fixed on the empty canyon trail below, entirely convinced of their secure, superior vantage point. Their arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. Kalen observed them, his senses sharp, noting their precise positions, their visible weapons, 2 rifles, 1 shotgun, and the easy, predictable rhythm of their conversation, which drifted on the high wind, crude talk of their payday and a careless mention of Corvus's impatience. They had positioned themselves for defense against the canyon floor, never once considering a threat from the sheer rock face they rested upon. Kalen pulled out the heavy Colt, checking the chamber with a quiet click that was swallowed by the immense silence of the mountain air. This was the moment of decision, 3 men, 3 minutes, 1 chance for a silent extraction. The attack was swift, silent, and horrifically efficient, a blur of motion dictated by necessity and honed by survival. Kalen knew gunfire would ruin the entire ambush. He bypassed the pistol, choosing the knife instead. The first man, leaning back against a rock, his rifle resting across his lap, never saw him coming. Kalen moved like a striking viper, his hand clamping over the guard's mouth, the knife finding its mark with surgical precision and speed, silencing the man instantly. The second man, distracted by the crackle of the fire, turned just as Kalen recovered, and instinct took over. Kalen used the heavy butt of the Colt as a blunt instrument, delivering a sharp, crushing blow to the man's temple, knocking him unconscious instantly before he could even draw a breath to shout. The final guard, alerted by the sudden, unnatural silence, scrambled for his rifle, but Kalen was already on him. He didn't hesitate, he tackled the man over the low ridge, pinning him down and holding the knife to his throat. "Talk, and you live," Kalen hissed, his voice dangerously low. "Tell me the signal Corvus's men used to confirm the area is clear." The guard, a young man with a face etched with fear, instantly complied, his survival instinct overcoming his loyalty to Corvus. He confessed that the all-clear signal was a simple, sequential burst of 3 flashes from a brass lantern, repeated twice, a subtle signal that was easy to spot from the canyon floor but easily dismissible as simple flicker. Kalen memorized the sequence, his mind already 3 steps ahead, ensuring his execution of the signal would be flawless. The moment the guard finished speaking, Kalen reversed his grip on the knife, but instead of finishing him, he used the heavy rope he had carried to quickly and expertly bind the man's wrists and ankles, securing him tightly and gagging him with a piece of cloth torn from the guard's own jacket. Elara had warned him against unnecessary bloodshed, reminding him that captured witnesses were far more valuable than dead enemies. With the 3 guards neutralized, 1 dead, 1 unconscious, and 1 bound, Kalen quickly stripped the bound guard of his uniform, donning the familiar, grubby leather jacket and hat to blend in should anyone approach the ridge. Kalen stood alone on the ridge, the cold wind whipping his hair, gazing down at the narrow, twisting, and now perilously silent canyon of the Serpent's Tooth. Below, the trail was empty, awaiting the arrival of the heavily laden wagons and the corrupt Captain Thorne. He checked the silver watch, $11:00 a.m. He had a mere 57 minutes before Elara's scheduled arrival and his crucial moment for the signal. The silence on the ridge was now his own, the air thick with the smell of pine and blood. He found the brass lantern and set it up, preparing to send the deceptive "all clear" signal that would lull the approaching convoy into a false sense of security, driving them straight into Elara's ambush. He knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but as he looked at the narrow, unforgiving pass, Kalen felt a terrifying clarity: he was no longer a victim or a slave. He was an executioner of justice, a protector, and a man who was finally, wholly, in control of his own destiny. He closed the casing of the silver watch with a definitive snap, ready for the 3 most important minutes of his life. The air hummed with tense anticipation. Kalen, now perfectly disguised in the dead guard's jacket, waited on the high ridge, his eyes fixed on the silver watch. At $11:57 a.m. precisely, he executed the signal, 3 rapid flashes from the brass lantern, repeated twice, a silent, official light promising clear passage. Moments later, the convoy rumbled into view, 3 massive, covered wagons groaning under the weight of the stolen silver and copper, flanked by a dozen heavily armed, dust-caked guards. Trailing behind the wagons, like a vulture circling its prey, was a smaller, expensive carriage bearing the regulator's insignia. Inside, Captain Thorne, a pompous, corpulent man in a crisp blue uniform, slumped with bored confidence. Kalen's blood ran cold when he saw who was riding shotgun beside Thorne, Malachi, the detestable auctioneer from Redemption Pass, now acting as Corvus's personal courier and accountant, riding high on the spoils of human degradation. Malachi's presence added a scorching layer of personal vengeance to the mission, confirming he was a deeper part of Corvus's syndicate than Kalen had known. The convoy, seeing the signal and trusting the silence of the pass, slowed its pace, preparing for the final bottleneck. Then, precisely at noon, Ilara's carriage, emblazoned with the proud Vance crest, appeared from a side trail, pulled by 2 powerful chestnut horses, pulling up sharply to block the entire width of the narrow canyon pass. Ilara emerged, an extraordinary figure of elegance and absolute authority, dressed in her fine wool coat and hat, but now armed with a heavy repeating rifle held steady in her hands. Her voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the canyon, cut through the silence like a clarion call. "Captain Thorne. Halt this convoy immediately. I am Ilara Vance, and these are stolen goods. You are aiding and abetting a criminal operation on Vance Mining Company property." The guards immediately raised their rifles, but Ilara's sheer audacity and the sudden, complete blockage of the route caused a dangerous, momentary hesitation. Captain Thorne erupted from his carriage, his face an apoplectic mask of fury, unable to fathom the audacity of a lone woman challenging his official authority and his lucrative, secret operation. He stomped toward Ilara, his voice booming with the bluster of a man accustomed to unquestioning deference. "Vance! Get that damned wagon out of the road. You have no authority here. These are regulated goods, and you are obstructing an official regulator route. Move, or I will have my men arrest you for piracy and insurrection." He reached for the pistol on his hip, completely oblivious to the hidden threat above, entirely focused on bullying the elegant woman in front of him. Thorne's reliance on his uniform and his perceived power was exactly the mistake Ilara had counted on. He was a paper tyrant, exposed and vulnerable, and his ego had blinded him to the true danger. As Thorne ranted, Malachi, the low-life auctioneer, was leaning out of the carriage, his eyes constantly darting, his instincts for treachery and danger far sharper than Thorne's official arrogance. His eyes swept the high ridges and, through the sun's glare, he finally caught a glimpse of Kalen, a man too clean and moving with too much purpose to be one of the careless perimeter guards. A flash of agonizing recognition, the man he sold, the man he thought he was rid of, coupled with the terrifying realization of the trap, tore through him. "It's the savage. Up on the ridge. It's him." Malachi shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror, pointing wildly at Kalen, the long-held secret of his survival suddenly exposed. Kalen knew this was the instant he had to act. He raised the Colt, not aiming for a killing shot, but a clear, disabling blow to take the auctioneer out of the fight and silence his panicked warnings. The crack of Kalen's rifle echoed through the canyon, a sharp, defining sound. Malachi crumpled instantly, clutching his shoulder, the gunshot acting as the definitive signal for the main assault. The single shot from the ridge instantly detonated the carefully balanced tension in the pass. Ilara didn't hesitate. She dropped to one knee and unleashed a controlled burst of fire from her repeating rifle, targeting the lead guards of the convoy, wounding one and scattering the others. The guards, caught between the sudden, terrifying precision of the rifle fire from the ground and the unexpected threat from the high ridge, devolved into immediate, disorganized chaos. Kalen, now in motion, began to descend the cliff face, using the rope he had carried, his descent covered by the confusion below. He fired strategically, using the height to disable key guards and suppress others, directing his shots not to kill, but to pin down the opposition and create a clear path for Elara to secure the wagons. The canyon was a maelstrom of screaming horses, panicked guards, echoing gunfire, and Elara's commanding voice cutting through the noise. Justice was no longer a plan, it was a brutal, deafening reality, and Kalen was the unexpected storm that Corvus had invited into his world. The battle was fierce, but the coordinated attack was working, the wagons were secured, Thorn was cornered, and the time for resolution was at hand. The ambush was a resounding success. The combined pressure of Elara's accurate, focused ground attack and Kalen's debilitating suppressive fire from the ridge had shattered the convoy's morale within minutes. The remaining guards, seeing their leader, Captain Thorn, disarmed and kneeling in the dust, quickly dropped their weapons in surrender, their loyalty to Corvus's payroll dissolving instantly under the threat of regulator imprisonment and Vance family vengeance. The 3 silver wagons, overflowing with crates bearing the stolen Oakhaven mark, were secured, the physical evidence of the crime undeniable. Elara stood over the disgraced Thorn, her rifle still steady, her expression cold and uncompromising, the victor in a high-stakes confrontation. Meanwhile, Kalen descended fully, landing near the whimpering Malachi, who was clutching his heavily bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of pain and profound, sickening fear as he looked up into the eyes of the man he had sold like cattle. Kalen knelt beside the wounded Malachi, the heavy Colt held loosely in his hand. The auctioneer began to plead, his voice high-pitched and choked with terror, offering bribes, apologies, and pathetic excuses. Kalen simply cut him off, his voice flat, dangerously quiet, entirely devoid of the vengeful rage Malachi expected. He was past anger, he was merely stating facts. "You took my life, Malachi," Kalen stated, his eyes locked on the sniveling man. "You called me savage and sold me for a profit. You were a party to the destruction of my home and my father's business. You thought I was broken and gone." He paused, letting the weight of the betrayal crush the auctioneer's spirit. "But you underestimated the price of a man's dignity. I don't need your death, Malachi. I need the truth." Kalen then pointed the barrel of the Colt directly at the man's uninjured leg. "Where is Corvus now, and where is the ledger detailing every payoff, every bribe, and every stolen shipment?" The implicit, immediate threat was enough to make Malachi instantly break, his self-preservation winning out over any lingering loyalty to Corvus. While Kalen extracted the crucial location of the ledger from the terrified auctioneer, a safety deposit box in a distant bank under an alias, Captain Thorn, realizing the true extent of his peril, began to panic. Thorn was not worried about the silver, which could be replaced, he was worried about the ledger, the document that held the details of his decade-long corruption and would cost him his uniform, his freedom, and his reputation. He made a desperate, stupid move, lunging for a hidden derringer concealed in his boot. Elara, whose focus never wavered, reacted instantly. She brought the butt of her repeating rifle down with a sharp, controlled blow to Thorn's head. The regulator captain dropped like a stone, knocked unconscious, his escape attempt foiled. Elara looked at Kalen, their eyes meeting in a moment of cold, precise teamwork. They were a perfect, lethal unit, driven by the same unwavering demand for justice. With the immediate threat resolved and the evidence secured, Kalen moved away from the captured men, walking to the edge of the canyon pass. He looked toward the distant, hazy outline of the mountains, the direction of Corvus's fortified settlement. Malachi's information, wrung out of his terror, confirmed that Corvus was not expecting any attack and was currently isolated at his stronghold, celebrating what he thought was a successful shipment. Kalen knew the seizure of the silver was merely the first, necessary blow. The final reckoning required facing Corvus himself, the man who had sold his life. He returned to Elara, handing her the coordinates and bank name for the ledger. "The ledger is safe, the silver is secured, and Thorn is neutralized," Kalen reported, his voice crisp. "The final act is Corvus. He will know by tomorrow morning that everything he built has collapsed. He will be at his most dangerous and his most vulnerable. We need to move now." Elara looked at the determined man standing before her, no longer the bruised and beaten savage, but a figure of immense moral and physical strength, and she nodded, her eyes shining with absolute, shared purpose. She knew the true price of the man she had bought was the justice he was now ready to deliver. They rode through the night, covering the long distance to Corvus's isolated retreat, a well-appointed but heavily fortified cabin nestled deep in a mountain valley. News of the Serpent's Tooth ambush traveled fast, and Kaelin knew Corvus would already be realizing the catastrophic extent of his loss. The man who had been riding on arrogance and theft was now a cornered animal, and the confrontation was inevitable. They approached the cabin at dawn, the golden light of the rising sun washing over the scene, promising a new day. They found Corvus exactly where Malachi had said he would be, not at his fortress, but alone, pacing frantically outside the cabin, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a rifle in the other, his face pale with a mix of fury and disbelief. He was yelling orders into the empty morning air, his entire fragile empire crumbling around him. Corvus stopped mid-sentence as Alara and Kaelin rode out of the trees, a chilling apparition in the still morning air. His eyes locked onto Kaelin, and a visceral, agonizing gasp tore through him. It was the absolute, total shock of seeing the dead walk, the man he had betrayed, ridiculed, and sold for pennies, now standing clean, armed, and backed by the formidable Alara Vance. Corvus's rifle drooped in his hand, his mouth working silently as he desperately searched for the swagger and power he had lost. Kaelin, he stammered, the name a question and a curse, his mind unable to reconcile the broken slave with the formidable man standing before him. Kaelin dismounted slowly, letting the silence hold the immense weight of their shared, shattered history. He held the Colt, but there was no rush of violence in his posture, he simply demanded accountability. Alara stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on Kaelin's arm, not to stop him, but to interject her authority and finalize the resolution legally and irrevocably. She spoke to Corvus, her voice calm and chillingly final. You don't negotiate with the law, Corvus. You don't negotiate with justice. We have the evidence to take your lands, your name, and your freedom. The Vance family will see to it that you are tried, and all assets will be justly restored to Kaelin, the rightful heir of Torvin. She looked at Kaelin, offering him the final choice, the ultimate act of restoring his dignity. Kaelin, he is your debt. Your choice. Kaelin looked at the terrified, broken man who was once his friend, now reduced to a whimpering coward, and the immense, consuming desire for simple vengeance evaporated, replaced by the profound satisfaction of complete triumph. Kaelin looked at the man who had called him savage, the man who had stolen his life, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered the Colt to his side. He wasn't going to sink to Corvus's level of petty violence. His revenge was not in blood, it was in the total and utter collapse of Corvus's existence. I don't need to kill you, Corvus, Kaelin said, his voice flat, resolute. You are already a ghost. Your name will be mud, your crimes will be known, and your life will be spent paying for what you stole. That is a fate worse than any bullet. He then stepped back, allowing Alara's men, who had quietly positioned themselves, to secure the shaking, defeated criminal. Kaelin looked at Alara, a silent acknowledgement of the path they had chosen, the path of principled justice. Corvus was hauled away, his cries of impotent rage fading into the distance, his reign of terror over. The Vances had secured the ledger, the silver, and the justice they required. Weeks later, Kaelin stood beside Alara at the official hearing, the true owner of the restored Oakhaven lands and the legal heir of his father's business. He was no longer a shadow but a respected man of the territory. As they rode back toward the Vance homestead, Kaelin was no longer running behind Alara's horse, he was riding his own, a strong, magnificent gelding, alongside her, their shoulders occasionally brushing, equals, partners, and friends. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver watch, opening the casing. The sun caught the polished metal, reflecting a bright, hopeful light. Alara had risked everything because she saw a man worth saving, and in his silent, determined fight for justice, Kaelin had saved himself and proven his worth. The savage was dead, the man Kaelin was finally free, riding into a future where dignity was his new currency, and the debt of trust was finally paid in full. And so, the dust settles on Redemption Pass and the winding trail of the Serpent's Tooth. Kalen, the man they tried to break, the man they branded as savage, stands tall, not as a ghost of the past, but as a pillar of the future. He reclaimed his name, his land, and his dignity, all because one woman, Elara Vance, had the courage to look past the chains and the scars, and see the truth, a man worth saving. She didn't just pay a price in gold, she paid in trust, and Kalen repaid that debt with unflinching loyalty and a justice sharper than any blade. Corvus's reign crumbled, Thorn's corruption was exposed, and the Wild West was reminded that some debts are not settled with money, but with the profound, unwavering resilience of an unbroken spirit. The story of Kalen and Elara is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest corners of the world, a single act of impossible courage can ignite a firestorm of change. What did you think of Kalen's final decision? Would you have taken your revenge on Corvus, or do you agree that justice, not blood, was the ultimate punishment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We have more epic Western tales of grit, betrayal, and unexpected heroes coming soon. Until the next ride, take care, and never let anyone tell you your price.